Hi, I'm Raina Kitty, and today I'm going to tell you why watercolor is my favorite painting medium. So this is my favorite watercolor palette. I've had it for like a decade and it was, I think, under $20. So one of the great things about watercolor is that you really don't have to spend a lot of money to get started. If you want to start painting, I think it's one of the best mediums to start with. Of course, there are more expensive options. These are watercolor concentrate. So they're a lot more expensive and honestly harder to work with. I prefer the cheaper ones. I'm not going to dive too deep into this. It's called gouache. It's a type of watercolor that's opaque. So it's, it's still watercolor, but it's entirely different to work with. Another great thing about watercolor is that you don't need to buy expensive brushes. You can really use whatever brushes you like. Again, these are some pretty cheap brushes. I think to start out, getting some round brushes that are, kind of pointy at the tip are great, and then some flat brushes for filling in space as well. And then here on the wall I have some examples of watercolor paintings that I've done, and I'll also put some in the corner over here on the screen. But so this one's a watercolor painting that I did. This one's a watercolor painting that I actually live painted at a music festival, which was crazy. Let me know if you guys want me to make a video about that. So these two were painted on paper, which again is pretty cheap. You can definitely get some really nice quality paper, which I actually do recommend, because the more you go over like a cheap paper, like the more layers you put on a cheap paper, it just like kind of breaks down the paper. Wetness on paper is kind of going to break it down. But this is actually watercolor on a canvas, which I don't think people really do that often, but I use the watercolor, like the concentrated watercolor, more as like a dye on this canvas. So that's pretty cool. You really don't have to follow the rules when I say you should do this or should do that. It doesn't actually matter. Art is all about doing whatever you want, what feels right in the moment. Here's a pretty cool example of using watercolor in an unconventional way. Here I used it to paint a wooden skateboard. So yeah. If you want to start painting, this is your sign to start. And like I said, watercolor is my favorite, so maybe it'll be your favorite too.